It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Trudi, who is an associate professor of biological anthropology at the University of Durham. She did a first degree in archaeology and anthropology at the University of Cambridge, but her passion is for archaeological excavation, and she's been volunteering at Vindolanda for over 20 years. And Trudi is currently writing a book entitled The Deviant Dead of Northumberland, of Vindolanda, which explores the themes of the talk she's about to give. Trudi.
Thank you everyone for coming. I think it was in the program, but just a warning that obviously the talk, given that the title, I'm going to be showing human remains throughout the talk and covering some pretty difficult topics along the way, but kind of showing the darker side of the Roman Empire, but bringing to life, hopefully, some of the individuals who have sadly died in, well, varying circumstances, as we'll see. So yes, what I'm talking about is deviant burials. When I'm saying deviant, that obviously has some sort of connotations. I'm kind of using it here mainly because I like alliteration. Deviant dead sounds kind of fun, but I'm meaning basically people who have died but haven't been buried in your sort of normal way. They haven't been buried in cemeteries. None of the people that we're going to be talking about today have come from cemeteries. Leading me on to this, which is usual Roman burials. They do happen. You have inhumations, you have cremations, but there's very little that's actually been excavated in the way of cemeteries along Hadrian's Wall, which is surprising considering, you know, how long the interest in the wall has been in the area, but very few cemeteries actually have been excavated. So the main one is Bird Oswald, which is a cremation pot that has come from Bird Oswald, I can speak. And the other sort of evidence that we have for burials tends to be in these sort of stray finds of tombstones. So for example, this is Ursula, who was a small child who's commemorated, and she's on display in Corbridge. And this fine lady is Regina, who was a British woman. She was a freed woman, and this is tombstone that her husband, presumably her previous owner, had erected to her. Now he was from Syria, and this has been found in Arbeia in South Shields. So you're already getting a sense that there's a lot of diversity along the wall, just from the tombstones themselves. What I'm talking about is like I said, people that have been buried in places, or not even necessarily buried in some of the cases, but have been found in places you wouldn't expect dead people in Roman times to be found, within dwellings, within the fort walls of Vindolanda, for example, in ditches. Ditches come up a lot in these, and these are the people I'm going to be talking about today. Now, why I'm talking, you don't need to read all of the words on this slide, but basically what I'm trying to do with each of the individuals, so I'm talking about very specific individuals here, which you can't necessarily do if you're talking about a cemetery population. Just to sort of go back to the cemeteries, if you excavate a cemetery, what you're getting when you're looking at the remains, you're looking at basically the rituals that the living have done for the dead. So you don't necessarily get a full account of that individual themselves, because what you're getting is the kind of the formal ritual that goes around burial. So the interesting thing with these people, because they haven't been subject to that, we can sort of say a lot more about them looking at their burial context. And so what I'm doing is, it's called sort of creating osteobiographies. That is creating a life history, a narrative from each individual skeleton that I'm going to talk about, or groups of skeletons when I come on to some of the ones later on. From this, we can basically, starting with biological anthropology, forensic anthropology techniques, we're going to be creating biological profiles of these individuals. How old were they when they died? What sex were they, if we can tell that? Can we tell anything about their ancestry? Sort of not necessarily where they were born, we might be able to tell that as well, but we might be able to tell something about sort of who their parentage or grandparentage was, and so on. So each of the individuals have different things that we can tease out from skeletons, pretty much depending on which parts of them that we've got. And there's some lovely ideas about what we can do if we're using this osteobiographical approach. So John Robb describes it. John Robb was one of the first people to sort of start using this approach. And he describes it as saying that it's giving history to those below the textual threshold. And that is, if you think about who are written about, I'm going to be talking about newborn babies later on and their mothers on a Roman fort. You don't get that in texts. Quite often people forget that there would have been newborn babies in the forts. And if you've got a newborn baby, you must have a woman there who has given birth to that child as well. So this is kind of hopefully bringing to light through these skeletons some of the people that get forgotten about in the things that are written. I'm not saying we should throw out all of the written stuff, you know, Pliny and those people, they're okay. But I'm here to sort of champion giving these stories from the skeletons themselves. I felt, because I'm not actually mentioning Hadrian's Wall an awful lot, even though that's in the title of the talk, I'm actually talking about forts mainly that are around near Hadrian's Wall, or in the vicinity of it. Obviously, I'm sure you all recognize Vindolanda here and the Mithraeum at Broccolita, though I'm not actually talking about that. This is the best picture. I liked the sunset. I'm actually going to be talking about Coventine as well, which I think is somewhere down here. I went looking for it last year and couldn't find where it was. It was a bit boggy. But there you go. That's a nice picture of the wall, just to give you a sense of where we're talking about. So what I'm going to do is go through these different individual skeletons or bits of skeletons and just say something about each one of them, what they can tell us about not just that individual, but wider issues, wider things that don't necessarily get thought about when we're thinking about kind of like the military in the Roman Empire, or if we're thinking about trade in the Roman Empire. I'm trying to tell us stories of real people because I've got the real skeletons. So we're going to start with well, this individual and another one like him, calling these the trophies of war. Those of you who are familiar, and I'm sure most of you are, with Vindolanda, in the Severian period, we get these roundhouses that you can see some peeking out from later walls. Some of them are not very round. I excavated that one. It was very dull. Yeah, no skeletons in it, so clearly not interested. So we've got these hundreds of these roundhouses at this time period. And here's a nice mock-up of what the fort probably would have looked like at this time. Now, to give you the context, this is the Severian period. There are revolting Scottish people up north, and so Severus is having to send armies up there. We know that there's lots of fighting going on. There's written accounts of this. And at Vindolanda, you get this very unusual setup of this small kind of fort or fortlet, not in its usual shape. And then outside of it, you get all of these roundhouses surrounded by defensive ditches. Possibly, and Marta might tell me that thoughts have gone on, but it's possibly places of refuge for local Britons who are being brought into sort of the protection of the fort in order to be kind of looked after by the remaining soldiers in this time of conflict. Obviously, if you're on the northern borders, you know, it's a time of uprising. So maybe this is what you're getting. You're getting kind of protection. I've heard other theories put forward about them being prisoner of war camp as well. Both of these would kind of fit with the argument or the theory that I'm going to put forward in terms of basically about structural violence. Now, structural violence is, and we know what violence, you know, swords and things, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, but structural violence is the things that go with that. What's happening to the people who are close to the individuals who've been impacted by the immediate violence, like the people who are being impacted by the war. We're seeing it in Ukraine at the moment. The men, the women, the children who are not necessarily fighting, but are still being impacted by the effects of the wars going on around them. And if we just, this is obviously a diagram of the fort that we've just seen, and I'm going to be talking about these two individuals, two men or bits of men. One found right here on the northern ditch, or in the northern ditch, and one found here so that we found that one in 2018. This one was in 2001, I think. This is a never be nice to anybody is my motto for this. I was letting the intern, who was her first time digging, and she was like literally a foot behind me. And I was like, you dig that bit because it looks easier. And then she just sort of like, she stops and holds something up and she goes, Trudi. And I immediately spotted it was a human skull. The poor lass, I nearly floored her out of the way, let me see. Yes, so never ever be kind to anyone because they'll find the human skull and you'll just have to watch. Anyway, I was very delighted to find this, or have this found. And it went alongside this. So you've got, what we've basically got here are two human crania that are in, one's in the northern ditch, one's in the south ditch. This is the ditch going around the fortlet. As I will explain, I'm kind of giving my punchline away here, but we think that these are basically severed heads that have been put on display on the fort, on the sides of the ditches, displaying, you know, their trophies of war. They've been brought back probably from the wars up in Caledonia. How do we know that? Well, this is the first one. He has a very prominent nose. So he's fairly certain he's European. And he's got this, even though there's not very much of him, he's got this very deep cut mark here. It's actually thinner at the front and goes deep towards the back. And it's a sort of V shape. It's a very classic cut mark of something like a blade, sort of being swept backwards like this. There's another smaller notch on the other side as well. These wouldn't necessarily have killed him. We can't always see when you're looking at skeletons what actually kills somebody, but what we can do is sort of make inferences from the wounds that they've had. If you've ever cut your head, it bleeds profusely. He would have been bleeding. This would have been coming down into his face, into his eyes, and you can imagine that would have probably distracted him enough for somebody to stab a sword in his stomach or whatever one does, and dispatched him quite quickly without leaving any further marks on him. And then presumably they've brought his head back. Now, we can make those inferences with a little bit more confidence than I would if we'd found him first. And that's because this beautiful chap is found, that's him, you can't really see him, but he's down there at the bottom of this ditch so this is, it's almost sort of at the same level, but in the south ditch surrounding this fort. And he was found, like I say, in 2001. And he was actually in two pieces when he was in the ditch, but they fit together very nicely. And we can see an awful lot more about him. Very confident with this chap that he's male. The brow ridges are pretty much give it away. Also, we have DNA that tells us he's male too, but I was fairly certain of that to begin with. Not that I'd let my students say that. So what happened to this guy? Well, I mean, he's been battered about, and not after, well, probably after death a little bit, but he's been battered at the time of his death. He has got numerous cuts on him. And what you can do when you're using forensic anthropological techniques is you can actually trace the patterns of what blow came first. Because if you strike somebody in the head, you get a radiating fracture, so a fracture that comes out of that. They will stop at sutures. You've got all of these sutures around your head where the individual bones come together. They will also stop at other wounds. So by looking at each wound and the fractures coming out of them, you can sort of piece together the sequence of what happened to his head. So very quickly, I think you can see, I mean, this is a fantastic 3D image of the skull that Rhys Williams has done at Teesside Uni. And there's this very, very strong and sharp wound. It actually travels up here, that side of it. It would have been right across here. It's on his right-hand side. Somebody has basically taken a sword and across his head. It's gone through, it's called the diplo, the brain case. It's gone through the skull and would have gone into his brain. That in itself would have killed that person. Might have taken a couple of minutes to die, but that would have floored him. That would have been enough. But the assailant did not stop there. The second blow, you can see this round fracture here. So this is typical of a blunt force wound. The edges aren't as smooth, it's more rounder, and it cuts through this blade wound. So they've sliced it in with a sword and then very probably taken their shield and hit him in the head. Now, I have read in those texts that I was dissing earlier that this is something that they were actually trained to do. They were trained to use the, I always forget what it's called. It's not a pommel, boss, thank you. The boss, and hit people in their heads. And that's quite possible what has happened here. Again, this guy is not really getting up from this. But that didn't stop them. There's another blunt force trauma actually here. You can see this bit's broken off more recently, but you can see this breakage around here. So there's been another, I mean, my envisaging is that this guy's now gone on the floor. He's fallen over, it's on the side, and that maybe they've stamped on him, creating that. But that wasn't it. Then, can you see this cut here? It's not the easiest thing to do to picture this, but this goes in at an angle. It's about 1.5 inches in width. It's about the right width for a cavalry sword. And it goes in an angle like that. So you can imagine he's on the floor, they've stamped on him, and then they've really made sure that he was absolutely not getting up after that by sticking the sword right into his skull. I thought I'd start off with the nice, less gruesome parts of the talk. And then, just because we haven't finished, this is the palate, the top of your mouth. Can you see this breakage here? These are actually called the palatine bones. You've got two of them at the back, and they go upwards in like an L shape. You've got this breakage here, and then the lacrimal bone inside the eye is broken. These happen, the way this is hinging, that did not happen recently. That happened when the person was newly dead, because bone acts differently. Bone is a living tissue. So whilst you are living, or not for very long after you've died, your bone will act differently. I also think the best way to describe it is if you go and like snap a twig in winter off a tree, it snaps because it hasn't got, forgive me, the tree juices running through it. But if you try and snap that same twig or the same tree in spring, when all of its tree juices are doing its tree things and growing new life, it won't snap, it'll bend. And that's exactly like bone tissue does that. And that's that. We've got this hinged bone. So that has got to have happened when the bone was still fresh. The breakage in the eye, they've cut his head off. There's also, I haven't got an image of it, but there's a nick around near the base of his skull that's indicative of him being decapitated. And then they've stuck him on a spike. And somebody really wanted this man dead. The other guy, he's got a cut, and you can imagine they stuck him in the stomach and he's dead. Move on to the next one. This one, they didn't just kill him, they overkilled him. They killed him again and again till there was absolutely not getting up. He must have been fighting hard. So you can imagine why they brought his skull back, because it's like, here's my trophy. Now, why might that be? Well, we've got DNA and isotopes. Isotopes are basically they come from the food and the water that you're drinking when you're a child. It goes into your teeth and it builds up the sort of chemical pattern of your teeth. So we can see, based on the oxygen and the strontium sort of signatures in your teeth, we can see where roughly, it's not exact, but we can see roughly where you grew up. So we looked at one of his molars, and it's from about 2010, so there's probably more individuals to go on this now, but this is basically strontium isotopes here, oxygen isotopes going along the top, and this is lots of different Roman burials. So this is giving you a sort of picture of what Britain is like. So this sort of cluster in the middle is pretty much the sort of signature of Britain. Now, when we were getting the analysis done, we also had some cow teeth from Vindolanda from around the same period analysed as well, because you imagine cows don't travel far. We couldn't really do this with horses, but with cows, they probably grow up in the same area or roughly the same area. So they're going to give you that local signature. So these blue squares are the Vindolanda cattle. This is our chap up here. He did not grow up at Vindolanda. He's not a local person. Actually, the signature, the isotope signature that we've got from him suggests that he comes either from the northwest of the Lake District or the northwest going up into Scotland, sort of north of the Wall. So he was likely one of those marauding Scots that I mentioned earlier. But interestingly, this is again from his DNA. And what this is doing, it's looking at, I don't know how well you can see, but all of these blue dots come from people who are African. All of these green dots, East Asian. These are, the yellow ones are American, and all of the purple dots are European. And he's flat bang in the middle of the Europeans. You'd expect that. But from all of the Europeans, you can, it sort of gives you this sort of analysis, it gives you the nearest fit. And his nearest fit is with a group of Italians. That suggests one of his parents was Italian or from somewhere near Italy. Now, he grew up in the sort of northwest of Scotland, so probably his mother would be from the northwest of Scotland. Are we looking at somebody who is the son of a Roman soldier? Now, it might be a lovely romance. It might be a nice story. What we know of war, what we know of the realities of war, that is not probably the case. This is probably the case of somebody whose mother or potentially grandmother, we don't know the exact sort of level of descendants, but somebody whose mother, we'll say, has been the victim of sexual violence in war. Does that explain why he was fighting so hard that they didn't just kill him, but they overkilled him? In a way, I'm filling in gaps. I'm making inferences that we can't answer, but I'm basing them on what the skeletons are telling us, what we're gleaning from the bodies themselves. Now, just to sort of prove that the Romans did do this, because again, if you look in the texts, I think Livy tells us that the Romans didn't do that. They did not cut people's heads off, because that's what barbarians did. Except nobody told Trajan, or at least Trajan's sculptor, because here are some legionaries building a fort, and there's some nice barbarian, barbarians have got beards, heads on sticks, whilst they're outside of the fort walls, and that's on Trajan's column, slap bang in the middle of the Rome. So clearly they weren't hiding the fact that they did do this. And this rather lovely chap astride his horse, I don't know how well you can see it, but in his hand, this is Insus. He was from the Treveri tribe, obviously he was a cavalryman, and he is the poor barbarian who he has decapitated under his foot. And here he is holding his head in his hand, obviously taking that trophy back to wherever Insus's base was in order to probably put him on a stick on display around the fort. So we've got this sort of sculpture evidence, this artistic evidence of this happening as well. So there's some other bits of evidence that can help me fill in these bits of what was going on. Now, another sort of interesting thing, this is a humerus, as is this one. And this humerus, when I was asked to come and have a look at it, the first thing I noticed was just how shiny it is here. You can see that, it's reflecting beautifully. Bones get this patina on them. It comes from being handled a lot. You know, this is why people wear gloves or should wear gloves when they're handling human bones or other bones, because all of the oils in your hands can transfer to the bones if they're handled a lot. All of the ones in my teaching lab have this sort of shiny patina on them because the students are all grabby hands with them. This has been handled a lot. Now, the other thing is, this is huge. You take this part here is basically your elbow, the measure across here. This is a man. We know he's a man. We've got DNA from him. He came out of the Northfield in Vindolanda. The breadth across his elbow here, 53 centimeters. He's quite small. He's right at the sort of top of the female range, right below the male range for Roman individuals. That's looking at people from Roman London and people from Herculaneum and Pompeii, where we've got the measurements. Nobody in any of those sets of measurements, though, the Londoners or the ones from Pompeii and Herculaneum, have an elbow that is as wide as this guy. I'm assuming he's a man. This width here is 74 centimeters. That is, I've looked at all of the details that I can find about modern populations, and that is up there with the largest of the male modern humans today. He was huge. So you can imagine why I'm thinking that this is another trophy. It was also found in that same south ditch around the Severn Fort. And you can imagine someone's cut their arm off, because if you've been battling this great huge guy and you've beaten him, you want to bring it back so you can. I pictured this kind of like them sitting around at night over the. Did they drink beer? Yes, they drank beer. Holding this up and going and telling the story over and over again, and probably all of his campmates going, "Oh no, he's getting the arm out again." So, other bits of war trophies. Now, just thinking about, let's talk about structural violence. Just thinking about, okay, that's you know, an anecdote around the campfire with the other soldiers, but thinking about those heads. One's positioned about here. One's positioned about here. Right in sight of all of these people. If these are prisoners of war, or if these are local Britons who have come in for the army's protection, what is that saying to them? That is saying, don't you go doing this. Keep peaceful, because this could happen to you. So it's that kind of, that implied violence, because a head on a stick is not going to be a nice, you know, they wouldn't be nice and skeletal like that. They'd be quite gooey for quite a while and a bit smelly, so you would notice them. And that must be sending a message to these people here. Anyway, oh, and this was just to sort of talk about the intergenerational violence. Again, I think this is actually the column of Marcus Aurelius, but here are women, children being taken away by soldiers. So again, this sort of thing, it's evident in the texts, evident in the art. Now, to keep with the cheery subject, I'm now going to talk about a murdered child. So this one, this is the child in situ. This is the walls of this building here. So that wall there is that wall there and here. And this poor child was found in 2010, tucked around this corner. And you can see they're on their left-hand side. Their arms are up in front of their body like this. That's not a normal Roman burial. I mean, for one thing, the Romans were superstitious. They did not bury their dead, certainly not a 10-year-old child. Yes, you might get some newborn babies under floors. That's quite a common thing, but that's totally different context. Here, you've got a child who's been stuck in this corner of this building, this barrack building. So this is in the 3rd century stone fort, probably built by the 4th cohort of Gauls. And they were found just beneath the floor here. The find itself, the location itself, suggests something bad has happened. Like I said, probably murdered child, or they've been killed accidentally, but whatever's happened, they've had a clandestine burial. This is not a burial where they've given any kind of ritual to. This child's been hidden away beneath the floor, and it's right at the furthest point back. That's the doorway there, hidden right at the back of the room. Some interesting things. Often skeletons at this kind of higher level in the ground at Vindolanda don't tend to survive. The bones don't tend to survive so well because the soil's quite acidic. But the child was really quite well preserved. I mean, you can see the body. This is the feet, the legs, the rib cage, and the arms here. Feet, beautiful. Even the little tiny wrist bones from the wrists were found. Here's a hand. The only thing that wasn't very well preserved was the head. This is a tiny bit of the temple bone, the bit around your ear. This is a little bit of the side of the skull. Very little of the face, very little of the head. This might be, and again, this is very tentative, but it might be if the child had been hit over the head with something and had open wounds, because we know from seeing experiments done with pigs, usually, that if you've got open wounds, it's basically where the maggots get to first. They go for anywhere sort of like they can have ingress into the skeleton, and it makes that area decompose quicker. So I'm kind of again I'm filling in gaps, thinking about other things. So I might be completely wrong, but that's my interpretation of maybe how this child was killed. Now, going to this biological profile. I know that he was a child. I could tell they were a child very early on. The ends of the bones, this is, let's stick with the humerus since we're looking at humery. The end of this humerus, that again is this bit here. There are two bones one that would attach on the inside and one that would attach here. This one that attaches on the inside starts at around 10 to 11 to 12 years old in girls, a bit later in boys. And that's the first bone, because the ends of your bones, when you're a child, the ends of your bones aren't joined to the full shaft of the bones. That's because you're growing. They fuse together once you stop growing. So again, this is a femur and it doesn't have the distinctive round head on the end. So that gave me an indication that there's definitely a child, and I could put her age down to, spoiler alert there, 8 to 10 years based on the pattern of the eruption of the teeth. Teeth erupt at a certain time, roughly within about a year or two. So we can get a fairly good age range that we think that this child was about 8 to 10 years when they died. Now, I've already slipped up and said her, but if I was giving this talk 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to say that, because a child this young, you don't have the morphology that basically the best way to sex somebody, if you've only got their skeleton, is from their pelvis. It's the most thing that's different between males and females, because females, their pelvis is evolved to giving birth, whereas males' pelvis don't do that. But at this age, the pelvis, can you see here, it's actually in 3 pieces. These different colors represent the 3 different bones. And this is one of those bones. This one's this one here. So you wouldn't have been able to tell, even if you'd had the complete pelvis, what sex this child was. But a new technique has come out in the last couple of years. This technique's been developed where, who knew that in your protein, in the enamel of your teeth, the proteins are based on a chromosome that is sex specific. So if you can look at the protein, you can tell what sex that person is. So I went cap in hand, and I said, "Can we have some money to go and test this, please?" Very kindly gave it to us, and test came out. I don't know what all these mean, but basically that shows us that she was female. So we have a definite sex of the child now. Just to say something about, there was no, I mean, obviously, when you've got a fragmented skeleton, we had about 75% of her. You can't say everything exact, but there was no obvious trauma. There was nothing obvious. There was no breakages. There was no new bone growth. There was also no signs of childhood diseases in her. Quite often, if a child has gone through prolonged disease or malnutrition, for example, whilst they're growing, it shows up in the teeth. You get lines called linear enamel hyperplasias. You get, it's like pitting that would show up along here. Nothing. She doesn't have any of them. So she's had a relatively, I mean, obviously she's probably had the usual childhood colds and things, but she's not had any prolonged periods of ill health or malnutrition. So again, things that we can use to sort of put together who this child might have been. We also got the isotopes done on her. Now she is the green dots here because we got it done from 2 teeth. The interesting thing about this child is we used the second molar. So the second molar, that grows between so it's forming between the ages of 2.5 to 7. So we know where she was roughly between the ages of 2.5 to 7. And it was most definitely not, there's the cows from Vindolanda, it was most definitely not in Vindolanda. It probably wasn't in Britain. If we look at the oxygen from her teeth, so the oxygen signature is 4.5. That's 4. So 4.5 is this, anything is in this red area. So she's come from south of Europe, like southern Spain, perhaps, or even North Africa. So this is a child that has grown up somewhere much warmer than Vindolanda, about until she was 7 years old. She's lived somewhere probably down in the southern Mediterranean area, possibly, like I say, even North Africa. And then in the last couple of years of her life, she's traveled all the way up to the north, to northern Britain. It must have been one horrible culture shock and temperature shock for her. So we know, this is what we know. We don't know though, who was she? Now, again, thinking about who the lives of these people might be, there's various different stories that we can tell. of who might fit this profile of a child who has moved from somewhere much warmer to a fort in the north of Britain. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these examples, but she could have been the child of a soldier, an elite soldier. We know that the centurions, definitely the commanding officers, but we've got all of that lovely evidence of the commanding officers' children from an earlier period, yes. But, you know, we've got shoes, little tiny baby shoes. We've got correspondence between the women, the commanding officer's wife, talking about her children. So we know that their children are there. She might also have been a child of a lower ranking soldier. Once upon a time, definitely no women in the fort, definitely no children, families. Work of people like Carol Vandriel Murray, Elizabeth Green are showing, most definitely, we know now that there are women and children present, possibly even living in the fort. The child, she might have been with a trader. She might have been traveling with her parents who were merchants. Or she might have been a slave. Each of these children, these sort of hypothetical children, would have a different visibility in the archaeological record. Already mentioned, in fact, I might even have a slide, here we go, of if it's a child of the elite, they show up because they are someone important in a way, or at least they belong to someone important. So yeah, they're mentioned in letters. We have potentially toys for them, wooden top swords here, this little lovely leather mouse, the little baby shoes, the very elite shoes that come out of the Praetorium, this lovely bit of handwriting, this copying of a piece of the Aeneid, which might be a handwriting exercise for an elite child who is learning to write. You wouldn't see that necessarily in the lower ranking children. You definitely wouldn't see it in a slave. And you think, well, if she traveled at the age of 7, maybe that's too young. But no, there's lots of written evidence for children that young being sold. Just an example here, a 6-year-old girl from Dacia who was sold in AD 139. That's around the same sort of age that our child might have traveled and been sold, if indeed she was enslaved. And the types of evidence, I mean, slaves difficult to see, but we know, I mean, obviously we know they exist, but we can sort of see them in archaeological record, things like the shackle burials. There was one recently, this is a collar, it's a slave collar. It basically says, if you find me, I've run away, give me back to my owner. Now, the fact that we have these slave collars that say, quite often they also say the same sort of thing, send me back to my owner. There's another writing tablet, this one from London, it's a wax stylus tablet that was found in the city of London. And that is a sale deed of a young woman named Fortunata. And in that, it's explicitly says she's in good health and she's not going to run away. So slaves run away. Now, thinking about if this child is murdered, if this child's been an elite soldier, the commanding officer's daughter, they're going to turn the place upside down to find her. If it's a slave child, slaves run away. Maybe they wouldn't have looked for her. So again, it's those sort of creating hypothetical children and thinking about the probability of them. How am I doing for time? Very quickly, and just mention this is something that I'm working on, that's still sort of thinking through a lot of this. But this is, again, it's from sort of fairly recent finds, though there's probably more of them that haven't necessarily been recognized yet. And what we're looking at here is that is a femur, there's another humerus, that's a radius, and that's a little rib of a newborn baby. The femur is about 76 centimeters, no, 76 millimeters in length, which is around the length of what a newborn, average newborn would be. And we have potentially up to about 7 individuals. And all of these babies, these neonates, have been found in ditch contexts. So again, we're not looking at we're not seeing here the burials I mentioned earlier, in some forts, you get children, newborn babies actually buried. And it's an old Iron Age practice. Again, in the Iron Age, you would have newborn babies sort of buried under housing and things. These are not burials. These are scattered individuals. If there were burials, we'd have more of the skeleton and you'd find it in a grave cut. These haven't been put in grave cuts. These have been babies that have been put into ditches, whether alive, whether they died shortly after birth and their mothers have put them in. Now, in lots of archaeological reports, that would be it. We just mention there's some babies and we'd move on. But to me, this is, it says so much more. There's so much more to think about here and to unpick. Who are these babies and who are their mothers? And why are their mothers putting these babies into ditches? This is not a normal burial practice. We've got, in some Roman cemeteries around Europe, you get fetuses buried. Often they're put in either they put housing tiles over them or underneath them. So we see newborn babies being buried. These have not been buried. They've been put in the ditch. Now, it could be infanticide. This is showing the excavations of a Roman villa, Uden Villa in Hambledon. It was excavated in the early 1900s and 97 newborn babies were found there. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. It's been interpreted as being a brothel and that these were victims of infanticide. There's a lot of debate over this that I haven't got time to talk about, but a lot of debate about whether it's infanticide or not. Potentially not. It might just be, if it was occupied for quite a few, a couple of 100 years, maybe 97 newborns isn't surprising. But again, they were all actually buried. So you get the complete skeleton, or roughly the complete skeleton. All I'm really going to say here is what I'm thinking about is the realities of what Roman motherhood on a fort would have been like. Again, thinking about who the women were. I suspect these are not elite women. Now, whether I say they are disposing is not the right word, because I can't believe that the women are disposing as in just casting aside. I think if a woman leaves a child somewhere, if it's alive, whether it's not, there's probably an awful lot of grief and emotion linked into this. There's a wonderful study, set of studies by one of my colleagues at Durham, Becca Gowland, who's calling it this infant mother nexus, i.e. this link between a mother and child starts before the child is born. And there is some reason why these babies have been put in. I'm not going to talk too much about it because I said this is something I'm still thinking about and still developing my ideas on this. But were these women forced into sex work? And you might recognize this is the Lupinaria, the brothel, the famous brothel at Pompeii. I don't think Vindlander would have something as well established like this, which you can kind of think at least would be kind of the upper echelons of sex work. Are we looking at women who are basically having to earn a living some way to fend for themselves? Maybe they're widows who've got no other means of supporting themselves. And if they've had children and they can't bring these children up, or if these women are enslaved themselves and don't want to bring a child into that, maybe that's why these babies have been left in the ditches. But lots to think about that. And very, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, just going to bring about, because I thought I'd better talk about something other than Vindlander. And again, this is fairly new work that I've been developing on a skull that's been known about for a long time. So this lovely lady here, I was basically asked to go and have a look at the skull, or at least the partial cranium, that came out of Coventine Well. So it was excavated in the 1800s, and along with the lovely sculptures and all of the artifacts, the offerings, including like face masks and heads, was this skull. And I don't know how well this shows that this is her here, and inside stained green from all of the coins that were found inside her. So she'd been placed in this well upside down with coins inside her. Now, from my analysis, the first thing that absolutely struck me was well, the shape of her face, at least what I can see, very wide across here, very wide over here, has a dip. This is called a post-rheumatic depression, and it's basically at the back of the head kind of dips down. These are all features that you see in people generally, obviously not everybody looks alike, but generally in people from Africa. So like Sudan, Nubia. Are we looking at a woman who is from that region? This is this very dull looking graph. What it says is African. It's about 93%. So I put measurements in, I put in some of the traits into different programs, and they're all coming out saying what I first thought when I spotted it, that I think she may have been African. So again, are we looking at something of an interesting, the rest of her isn't in there. This is not a body being thrown into a well. She's been curated. She was probably in this sort of skeletal state when she's gone in. There might have been a bit more of her, but she hasn't decomposed in the well. I think she's been displayed prior to having been deposited, and quite potentially, don't know how well you can see them, but there are, this is her eye, the socket for her eye. So this bit is the bit of bone coming down here, and there are scratches. There's a cut mark here. These are cut marks. I mean, potentially they're post-mortem damage, but to me, I think they may well be cut marks from defleshing. And there are echoes of this in other places. There's a young boy's skull who's found at the bottom of a well in a pit near Colchester, who's also been defleshed before he's been placed in the bottom. Are we looking at some sort of ritual religious deposition here? Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on that. This was me being poetic, sort of going, basically because I like the pictures, going from the sort of the fogs of the mists of time to something much more clearer, or at least, you know, I like this image because it's not what the fort looked like exactly. We can't look exactly into the past, but we can start building up pictures with the skeletons of what we think these people's lives might have been. And that just leaves me to say thank you to Marta for inviting me to talk, and to Dr. Andrew Burley and the Vindolanda Trust for allowing me to play with their skeletons. Thank you.